Ladies and gentlemen, I extend a warm welcome to all of you to the webinar titled Polish and European Ways to Fight Propaganda and Disinformation Best Practices. This webinar is organized within the grant entitled Polish Experience in Combating Disinformation, Inspirations for the Western Balkans, which is the public task financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland within the grant competition Public Diplomacy 2023. We are honored to have a panel of distinguished experts who specialize in Russian disinformation, security issues in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Our panelists include Dr. Aleksandra Kuczyńska-Zonik, who heads the Baltic department at the Institute of Central Europe and serves as an assistant professor at the Catholic University of Lublin. Dr. Jakub Bornio, a senior analyst in the Visegrad department at the Institute of Central Europe in Lublin, and he is an assistant professor at Wroclaw University, and Dr. Spasimir Domaradzki, a senior analyst in the Balkan department at the Institute of Central Europe in Lublin, and also an assistant professor at Warsaw University. I'm Tomasz Stępniewski, the deputy director of the Institute of Central Europe, and also associate professor at the Catholic University of Lublin. And the webinar will contain two rounds of questions. Without further delay, let's proceed to the first set of questions. And we will begin with the question directed to Dr. Jakub Bornio, followed by an inquiry into the characterization of the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Focusing on the perspective of Russian disinformation. Poland, being a reliable supporter of Ukraine, finds itself by effectively exposed by physical battleground encompassing the information sphere. It is imperative to acknowledge that this conflict relates not only to Russia and Ukraine, but also to Russia's engagement with the West. So, can Poland, as a committed ally of Ukraine, effectively counter these disinformation campaigns and Russian propaganda? So the floor is yours, Jakub.
Thank you, Tomasz. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. I hope we are going to have a fruitful discussion. Well, Tomasz, this is a very accurate observation that you made, and I will start by saying that currently, the war is being, waged. The wars are being waged on in different spheres. What is more, the warfare was never and is not the constant phenomenon or fixed phenomenon. It always had evolutionary character. It affects various spheres of human activity where there is something to gain, and that includes not material and material assets and people's minds, because this disinformation and propaganda warfare is about people's minds, are also this kind of asset. As to your question, I have already said that during one of the previous seminars that NATO and Poland in particular are in a proxy war with Russia, with all its consequences. But it's not only about waging the war in the Ukrainian territory, but also about this wider tensions between West and Russia and Poland and Russia. After all, the tensions between these two states of Poland and Russia are at very, very high level. And the clashes appear not only in the physical sphere, but also this cognitive, non-physical sphere. So far, when it comes to Polish-Russian relations, these are obviously non-kinetic tensions, and Russia tries to keep it that way. It carries out its provocations and narratives below the threshold of the war, but it is striking anyway. And the cognitive warfare that includes propaganda and disinformation is its finest example. And I will start with, general, but and at the same time not very cutting-edge assumption that Russia's propaganda and disinformation activities are always tailored to the audience they are targeting. And thankfully, from the Polish perspective, Polish society, because when we talk about propaganda and disinformation, these are societies, especially in the democratic systems that are the main target of this kind of activities. Not the only one, but the major targets. So the Polish society has this kind of natural self-defense system that makes it to some extent immune to this kind of very vulgar, very primitive narratives like that was NATO that started the war, that is NATO that pushes for war, or Russia only defends itself, or Russia didn't start the war, and so on and so on. And this is mainly due to the Polish people's historical generational experience of relations with Russia. And I'm not saying that this kind of narratives are not present, are not being spread among Polish society, but to put it in a very simple words, Polish people simply do not buy it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that Russia gives up on its cognitive warfare toward Poland and toward West. It's rather opposite. And Russia uses a whole assets of toolkits, the whole toolkit in its strategy. There are, for example, pro-Russian media outlets, accounts in social media, bots, useful idiots, analysts who sympathize with Russia, and as we most recently learned, also stickers that are widespread in the Polish city, on the streets of Polish cities. And obviously, it includes every other typical measures typical for this cognitive warfare. But in the context of the war in Ukraine, Russia is trying to achieve couple major objectives in Poland, and these are predominantly lowering social support toward the policy of supporting Ukraine, lowering social support toward strategy of deterring and repelling Russia, lowering social trust toward state institutions and state authorities, and lastly, I would also say lowering the support for the allied policy. So for example, the easiest way to, each of these campaigns, each of these objectives require different disinformation campaign that is based on very unique foundations. And the narrative that Russia carries out must be legitimate. So, for example, the easiest way to lower social support toward policy of supporting Ukraine is to invoke to the uneasy past, simply to put a wedge between two nations. And the most sensitive event in this bilateral Polish-Ukrainian relations is obviously the Volhynian crime. This is the best example of how Russia tries to exaggerate these tensions between two nations. And there are various ways to fuel this resentment. It could be, for example, adequate media coverage, or some kind of event where nationalistic symbols were presented, where they appeared. So it could be used as an example that, for example, cult of Ukrainian insurgent army and its icons is widespread in Ukraine. And Russian propaganda, Russian intelligence is even able to orchestrate provocations which are to prove the poor state of Polish-Ukrainian relations. So, for example, to prove that Poles are not welcomed in Ukraine and Ukrainians are not welcomed in Poland. And in 2020, we published together with the Institute of Central Europe an article in which our listeners may read how exactly Russia, prepared this kind of provocation and orchestrate this kind of intelligence activities. But when it comes to the other objectives, so for example, lowering social support toward the policy of militarization and strengthening of Polish armed forces, Russia must use other narrative, other instruments, and these are, for example, aimed at convincing society that as long as Poland lays low, it will be not attacked by Russia, or to put it in other words, that it is dangerous to meddle with Russia. So Poland should stop its politics, its policy. And the most recent case of fake pictures presenting Wagner mercenaries at the Polish-Belarusian border are one of the best examples, one of the finest examples of this kind of strategy. What's more, so far Poland is doing quite well, I would say, when it comes to repelling this Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns. Vast part of society, regardless of the fact that the war is still ongoing and it lasts quite long, that vast part of society understand that Ukraine must be and should be supported, that there is an urgent need of militarization and strengthening of Polish armed forces. Poles are very enthusiastic when it comes to hosting the allied forces on their soil and so on and so on. As I have already said, it is mainly due to the kind of natural immune system of Poles, and the most recent case of Russians who were pasting stickers of Wagner Group, suggesting that that the mercenaries are already in Poland, is its best example, because that was actually thanks to the ordinary man who recorded the guy who was pasting these stickers that Polish intelligence captured the guy. So you clearly see that Polish society is to some extent very, very conscious about what is happening and very immune to that. What's more, great amount of analysts also deal with an issue. They elevate level of social consciousness by publishing plenty of reports on the issue, by spreading news via social media, that the Russian propaganda is here on the ground.
If I may, so thank you very much for at the moment for your thoughts about the Polish resilience system, and that Polish society is immune to this Russian disinformation and propaganda tools. And I would like to ask Dr. Aleksandra Kuczyńska-Zonik a question concerning the Baltic states, because we are dealing with Baltic states, so which these states also hand-to-hand struggle with the disinformation and Russian propaganda. So do you see intensity in recent weeks regarding to Russian propaganda, which is directed at the Baltic states, or it is normal for the Baltic states to be vulnerable to such disinformation efforts from Russia? And furthermore, which Baltic state demonstrates the most resilience in the face of this Russian disinformation attacks? So the floor is yours, Ola.
Thank you very much, Tomasz, and thank you, Jakub, for such interesting introduction and analysis of Polish case. I think that comparing the Baltic states, I can see some similarities with Poland and some dissimilarities, of course. And starting talking about the Baltic states, we can say that they have been very important for Russia in sense of propaganda, because of historical and demographic factors in the Baltic states. Thinking about history, I mean the relations, cooperation, business cooperation, economic relations between Russia and the Baltic states since they regained independence in the 90s, and of course the Soviet Union before that. And of course the demographic situation, which means that in Lithuania, probably the most important Latvia and Estonia should be mentioned, because in Latvia and Estonia there are more or less 30% of Russian-speaking minorities. So it means that for Russia, the Baltic states have been quite vulnerable to disseminating propaganda and disinformation. But we cannot say that it is a huge problem for the Baltic states now, because for several years the governments of those countries started to prepared themselves and started to introduce several countermeasure instruments for dealing with Russian propaganda. Those measures have been taken both on national and regional levels. On regional level, I'm talking about European Union and NATO cooperation because those countries cooperate with different countries, debating and implementing different strategies and plans and instruments on the national ground. In the region, I should mention Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki, NATO Strategic Communication Center on Excellence in Riga, Cyber Defense Center in Tallinn, as well as Council of Europe. And there is also another example of regional cooperation as Nordic Baltic 8. So those regional organizations help and assist the Baltic states individually to counter Russian disinformation on the national ground. When it comes to national approach, we have to mention that there is the awareness of Russia's disinformation. About Russia's disinformation is growing in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and the states try to introduce modern, open, and free media environment and democratic environment. So, on the one hand, it means that there are a lot of efforts to educate people about the consequences of disinformation, how to choose the best source of information. But on the other hand, they try to secure themselves from hybrid threats from Russia. So, in the context of war between Russia and Ukraine, the Baltic states, from the very beginning of the war, the Baltic states banned several pro-Kremlin media in the Baltic states, which were very, very popular before the war, especially in Latvia and Estonia, but also in Lithuania when we are talking about Polish minority, which is quite interesting. So those media were banned, but it doesn't mean that currently this information is not disseminated in the Baltic states. It is in opposite, because there is social media where the information, narratives, for example, about migrants, about NATO or the United States, those narratives are still disseminated in social media. So it means that it is still crucial for the Baltic states to educate, to implement new strategies, to develop their own content and make their own media more attractive. Mm-hmm. So if I could only mention what are the main points of state strategies, I would mention public diplomacy, social communication, develop social communication between the government institution and the public, psychological operation, and of course policies, including educational policy, plans, and once more education about to grow, to make the awareness of society grow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Aleksandra, for your thoughts about the Baltic states and how they deal with Russian disinformation and propaganda, and about the strategies which has been used by these states. And now it's time to move to Dr. Spasimir Domaradzki. And could you delve into the Balkan countries with a particular focus on Bulgaria, examining the extent of Russian influence? How does Russia seek to exploit the situation in Ukraine and influence Bulgaria, positioned as a frontline state in this context? So to what degree is Russia's disinformation campaign effective within Bulgaria? So the floor is yours, Spasimir.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. Thank you for your invitation. And I would like just briefly to sketch, because the question is very extensive. We could talk for hours, but I think that what is most important is to grasp the specifics of the region, where indeed Russia's presence is quite obvious. It is not only present as we are used to think about it through its relations with Serbia, through its presence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in particular in the Republic of Srpska, but also through political channels, through its diplomatic missions, also in North Macedonia, also in Bulgaria, and other countries of the region, which proves that the Balkans are not something that is non-important for Russia. They provide an opportunity not only to destabilize the situation in the region, but it also serves the potential cause of further impacting the European Union in itself. And in that sense, the Bulgarian case is very interesting, because what we can see are two quite specific phenomena. First and foremost, the Bulgarian national myth, which is or was, especially during the communism, embedded in absolute lack of criticism for the Bulgarian-Russian relations since the late 19th century up until the 21st century. The second issue is the specifics of Bulgaria as a country, on one hand, a member of the European Union and NATO, but on the other hand, considered as a country whose indicators reveal that it is one of the, let's say, least developed countries or laggards when it comes to a number of indexes and issues. And actually, one of these elements that we can see is also the question of this index of media literacy, which reveals that Bulgaria is among the countries in the bottom of this index. That clearly shows that there is a profound issue when it comes to the question of how the state functions, but also how information is being treated. And if I can focus for literally 2 minutes on the question of this disinformation environment, I hope that this will shed a bit more light on the problems of the country. So if we look at Bulgaria as a case in the region, what is very interesting is that we actually we can observe the existence of an extremely fertile ground for disinformation. This stems from the fact that numerous elements that, for example, it was quite well mentioned by Jakub in his intervention, prove that even when the state is unable to prevent disinformation, you also have additional mechanisms that defend the society, both public awareness, mobilization, willingness to participate actively in the public debate that makes people aware of what is happening. Well, that's one issue that is lacking in Bulgaria. The second very important matter is something that we can see through the prism of the current political instability over the last 3 years, which is the weak state structures. Weak not in the sense that the state is collapsing, but weak in terms of their lack of, let's say, strong association with the society itself. What you have is existing state institutions and general popular mistrust towards the state. If there is anything that made it very explicit, that was the COVID crisis. Bulgaria was among the countries with the lowest immunization rates, with the highest percentage of conspiracy theories and problems stemming from the inability or the lack of trust between the people and the state. Secondly, what comes out of these problems is the distance of the people who do not want to be part of the state narrative, and that also opens a huge spectrum for disinformation. The third element is actually a problem that is both a cause and a consequence of these two aspects, and it can be added to a question of these longue durée structural problems of Bulgaria's transition, and it is the absolute relativization of everything. In that sense, the lack of moral benchmarks, the lack of reliable sources, and the mistrust towards the government produce an environment in which everything is possible. Every single idea can be questioned, and there is no reference to which we can refer. You can imagine that in Bulgaria, the word Harvard has become a curse word because the prime minister graduated in Harvard, and now one of the elements of the political fight against him is to offend him on Harvard. So you can see how far this lack of trust towards any authority appears. But we need to understand that these are not issues that were artificially created. They appeared over the last 3 decades as a consequence of certain experience within the country, which is on one hand a member of the EU, but on the other hand, it has a very high percentage of disappointment with the European integration. This disappointment is a consequence of the internal problems of the country. Not the EU in itself is a problem. If there is any disappointment with the EU, it is because there were high hopes that the EU will resolve the internal problems that were never resolved over the last 30 years. And if we add to that the fact that the Russian embassy was some time ago openly accused of financing people who disseminate disinformation in Bulgarian media, people who are considered to be opinion makers with some pocket money on a monthly basis, then you can imagine that all this picture provides a very clear perspective of how cheap it is to disseminate this information when it comes to such a country, and that gives us profound concerns how that can be challenged. The truth is that with the lack of these two components, relevant and reliable sources of information and strong public opinion and civil society, we have a perfect environment for disinformation that operates, whether we like it or not, quite efficiently in Bulgaria at this point.
Thank you very much, Spasimir, for your perspective on Bulgaria. By the way, Bulgaria is a really interesting case. So nobody is talking within the European Union about the rule of law and corruption in Bulgaria, only Hungary and so on. But Bulgaria is really interesting. But let's proceed to the second round of questions, shorter one. So now I would like to pose a joint question to Dr. Jakub Bornio and to Dr. Aleksandra Kuczyńska-Zonik. So I would like to ask you about a prospective scenario regarding the evolution of the situation in Ukraine. But could you please focus on Russian disinformation as it relates to Poland and to the Baltic states? Can we anticipate that countries such as Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia will be exposed to Russian disinformation campaigns in the upcoming weeks and months? If so, what strategies can be employed to address Russian disinformation effectively? So let's start with Jakub answer.
Thank you. I will do my best to be faster, this time. Tomasz, I am pretty sure that provocations and propaganda activities will be intensified in the coming weeks, as there is a parliamentary election 1 month in Poland, and we are just in the middle of campaign, and political leaders are harsher than usual in their rhetoric. And it will come as no surprise if I say that one of the weakest spots in Poland's resistance is the level of social polarization and social stratification. And what I would suggest is to soften a bit the political dispute, not only among politicians, but also among ordinary citizens. And most importantly, stop playing with strategic interests of a state for individual purposes, individual political purposes. Only this much, and at the same time, so much. The other thing is the counterintelligence. What we have learned and witnessed in the most recent weeks is that Russia is able to recruit Russian-speaking citizens of post-Soviet states who currently reside in Poland. And they offer them relatively large amount of money for different kind of activities, including provocations, and including provocations that are being organized or co-organized in Poland. And these might be very, small things like street clashes between Poles and people who pretend to be Ukrainians, or even are Ukrainians who are not loyal to their state. And what happens next? The clashes are being recorded, then they spread in social media with appropriate coverage, with appropriate narrative. They spread there, and we have a small disinformation campaign. The problem is that the recruitment process for this kind of activities takes place in Russian-backed social media. And I think that they need to be properly tracked by Polish counterintelligence agencies. So yeah, these are two issues that I wanted to raise, which are out of a obviously bigger picture. But as my distinguished colleague Spasimir just said, we could talk about it whole day, and that wouldn't be enough.
Thank you very much. And Aleksandra, could you focus on the Baltic states? Thank you.
Yes. As I mentioned before, because of several strategies which were applied by the Baltic states, yet they are more resilient than they used to be before, but they are still vulnerable to different hybrid threats from Russia. So I would say that special moments, special events which are going to or which are planning in the Baltic states in a few months would be used by Russia to introduce new strategies, new narratives, such as elections in the Baltic states. For example, in Lithuania next year we've got triple elections on the level of presidential, parliamentary, and European Union Parliament. So those momentum probably will be used by Russia to intensify its approach toward the Baltic states. Of course, narratives such as the Wagner Group or the tensions on the border may also be used by pro-Kremlist organization or institutions against the Baltic states, but shifting our discussion to more positive direction, meaning the strategies or the effectiveness of strategies, I would say that the Baltic states should increase activities on educational level. So once more, education. What is also important, it is to make own media more attractive and to implement new technologies in media, and make the media more accessible to national minorities, because as I said before, Polish and Russian-speaking minorities are also vulnerable to Russian narratives. Finally, it is necessary to promote civil attitudes toward the state, toward the government, because if the population do not trust the government, they are more vulnerable to trust a different source of information.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. So the case of Baltic states is really interesting. How these states, small, are dealing with Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And now I pose a question to Dr. Spasimir Domaradzki concerning the assessment of the situation in Bulgaria through the lens of Russian interest. Will Russia persist in applying its influence to sow instability in Bulgaria as well as in the broader Balkan region? Is Russian propaganda, particularly concerning the conflict in Ukraine, gaining attraction in the Balkans? Are the Balkan countries equipped to counteract this propaganda, or do they not perceive Russia's actions as a disinformation? So the floor is yours, Spasimir.
Thank you, Tomasz, again. Many questions, little time, but let me try to at least briefly address most of them. First and foremost, whether Russia used the situation in Bulgaria, absolutely yes. As I have mentioned already, it is not only the environment that is fertile, but also we have numerous examples of activities related to Russia's interests. We need not to forget that Russia played a profound role in Bulgaria's energy sector. Up until today, even in the context of the war, the role of the largest and only company which is owned by Lukoil plays a profound role. We can see also constant comments in public media that try behind the argument of objectivism to juxtapose the Western arguments with the Russian narratives, which quite often makes these public debates a kind of a sources of absolute mockery, where people cannot really get an idea what is at stake, because you have two completely incompatible narratives with people just talking without listening or trying to connect with each other. On the other hand, and I would expand this here, we need to be aware that within the larger political picture of the region, there are also embedded national interests, which sometimes, whether we like it or not, they overlap with the Russian interest. The Western arguments about rule of law and democracy quite often come as a tight shirt for local politicians, and they search for opportunities to build up alternative narratives. When they start building up alternative narratives and blame the EU or the West or the US for whatever, the Russians step in by just providing additional arguments, and this propaganda actually also operates quite well. In that sense, indeed, we have in the Balkans, in the sense of fertile ground. But in order to be honest, I have to admit that there is also a very ambiguous attitude of the West towards the Balkans itself, because if we look at the membership perspective, well, you have countries that, like Bulgaria and Romania, you aptly pointed out, never brought to the fore when it comes to rule of law and democracy matters, but countries that have much more profound and substantial problems than Poland in that respect. They are members of the EU. On the other hand, countries like Serbia, that doesn't differ much when it comes to the nature of its political system from Bulgaria, are not members of the EU. So you have this kind of ambiguous attitude, and people see it. We can claim that, oh, that's not true, but the popular reaction is that there is more and more distancing, and unfortunately it doesn't work well also for the matters that matter for the West when it comes to its confrontation with Russia on Ukraine.
Yes, so thank you very much, Spasimir, and you are right that, as I said before, that Bulgarian case is really interesting. So, and it's really good to put stress on fact that there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems domestically and internationally, and it's necessary to focus on these issues. So time is speeding fast. So I would like to thank you all for your participation in this vital discussion. I would like to thank Dr. Aleksandra Kuczyńska-Zonik, Dr. Spasimir Domaradzki, Dr. Jakub Bornio for your thoughts and for your perspectives on disinformation and Russian propaganda in Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you very much for the audience, and see you and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.